Well, hey there, everyone. Good morning. Welcome on into North Dakota today. Today is National Poker Day with a colorful history in the Old West. Poker has now seen a recent boom in popularity all over again. Here to share some stories about the origins of poker and its ties to the Wild West is celebrity historian, our good friend, Raffi Andonian. Good morning, Raffi.
Good morning. Let me try my poker face. Poker face, poker face. I like Lady Gaga. But I'm not very good at it because I smile a lot when I'm on camera, especially.
Wait, same for me. Also, I love that song, obviously. Who doesn't?
Yes.
But tell us, how did poker all get started?
Well, there's a couple different theories. One is that it starts in China about 1,000 years ago, a version of the game. There's also a version that came out of Persia that's called Oznaz. That's maybe about 500 years old. But I think most likely, and kind of what the agreement seems to be now, is coming out of France in the 17th century. There's a game called poker. And as you might imagine, that game came across the Atlantic, and it has its own origins in other countries also, like in Spain and Germany, so kind of a European region. And it's based on a game that you would draw cards and you would gamble and you would bluff a lot. So it sounds kind of familiar, right? Well, it comes across the Atlantic in New Orleans. And imagine that, New Orleans and gambling associated from the early days. And of course, the Louisiana Purchase brings a whole bunch of land into the United States, including Dakota Territory, which included not only what is today the Dakotas, most of them, but also Wyoming, Montana, part of Nebraska. That's how they entered the U.S. And that culture comes with riverboats up the Mississippi River. Think about riverboats in the gambling scene, comes up to north of St. Louis and beyond. And as a result, kind of gets anglicized and develops into that from poke to poker. And this is over the course of the early to mid-19th century. What happens in the mid-19th century? The Civil War, the American Civil War. And when that happens, now you have soldiers campaigning all over the country, and they need something to do in their leisure time. So they play poker, and that helps popularize it. And of course, after that expansion west in the old Wild West days in the 1860s, 70s, 1880s, as the railroad is expanding, and poker gets really popular for leisure and recreation out in the Old West as well.
Okay, what an incredible look at the history there. But now we're pretty much familiar with just a few different variations of poker, right? We've got Texas Hold'em, 5-card stud, what else?
You have different variations, yes. And if we focus on the Old West a little bit, we think of kind of what happens out in the Wild West. They played not only variations of poker, but they played what we would call blackjack. They also played Monte, which is a Mexican game, and they played Faro, which is based on, you might have seen this in movies. There's these cards with Pharaohs on them. There's actually some of them over my shoulder right here. You can see I like Pharaohs myself, being a history guy. But I think what's really fascinating about that is that gambling was a professional, like a profession out in the Old West, in the Wild West. And amongst the first facilities were recreation facilities when they would go out west. So I'll give you a few quick examples.
Yeah.
As the railroad was expanding west in the 1860s, you have these temporary towns that pop up at the rail ending as they're doing construction, and these tents would pop up, and there'd be a lot of gambling there. And then when the railroad would continue to expand, the tents would just move over, and the gambling would continue over there with the construction workers and such. Another example, how about cattle drives that we think of? Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, how about Wild Bill Hickok, very famous. And these guys were also lawmen in addition to professional gamblers, something we don't think about associated today. So these are happening in the cow towns. And then how about with the mining towns, one of which was, of course, Deadwood in Dakota Territory. Now we have our friend Wild Bill Hickok, who shows up over in Deadwood again, and of course he gets killed after the dead man's hand, which is the 2 aces and the 2 8s. That's where he ends up in the shootout and dies over a dispute over poker. And he got his start also over poker and his reputation, because when he was in Springfield, Missouri, a number of years before, and not as well known, he got into a dispute in a poker game with a guy named Davis. And when Davis, his last name was Tutt, Davis Tutt, and they got into a dispute over how much money he owed in a bet. So Tutt took Wild Bill's watch and held it, and that insulted Wild Bill's reputation because he's a professional gambler. So they're saying, wait a minute, I may not be able to pay my debts. That's what you're implying. So he parades it around town with the watch, insults Wild Bill, who challenges him to a shootout in the town square. And in that one, Wild Bill Hickok won and killed the other guy. But it made him a famous person that was known as not only a gambler, but it gave him a big reputation, in part because a jury found him not guilty and a bunch of people threatened to lynch him because they thought that wasn't a fair verdict. So he takes off off and goes other places. Eventually ends up in Deadwood, of course, in Dakota territory, and over a similar disputes ends up killed. So poker was a big deal. And think about these guys. These are steel-nerved kind of people. And the reason they're so important out Wild West is sometimes they're actually even dealers, not just lawmen, but dealers. And there's two main reasons for that. One, they're celebrities. If you have a celebrity at your gambling resort, you're going to attract an audience, right? It makes sense. And number two, because they had those steel nerves, if you're a thief, you're not going to mess around trying to steal money from that dealer because you know that guy is cold. You know that guy can pull a gun out real quick, so you're not going to fool around. So there's a reason that these guys would walk the line sometimes, not only in being outlaws, but also actually being on the side of the law or on the side of the resort because these interests were all interconnected out in the old and Wild West.
Well, with a history like that, it makes sense why poker can seem so intimidating in this day and age. Thank you so much for joining us and talking all about National Poker Day.
Thank you.
We'll check in next time, Raffi. Have a good one.